It's day 3 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers. Today we get a look at maybe the sweetest Panharmonicon ever, a confusing but powerful new cat legend, a card that will win the game if you can get 1,000 counters on it, and so much more. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers, and we have a ridiculous amount to talk about today. The cards are sweet, the cards are powerful, the cards are flavorful. We gotta get right into it, start talking about sweet new Lost Caverns of Ixalan cards. Before we do, 2 quick reminders. First, if you need some of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers, head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Lost Caverns of Ixalan. First up today, we got a new mythic cat legend in Sovereign Okinec Ahau, a 4-mana 3/4 legendary cat noble. It's got ward 2, so a bit of protection, and then it has a super powerful but very confusingly worded ability. So when it attacks, for each creature you control with power greater than that creature's base power, put a number of +1/+1 counters on that creature to equal the difference. So here's a quick, easy example of what this actually means. So let's say you have a Memnite on the battlefield. It's a 1/1, so its base power is 1. But you also have a Glorious Anthem on the battlefield, giving all your creatures +1/+1. Memnite's actual power is going to be 2 because of the Glorious Anthem. Its base power is 1. When Sovereign attacks, it'll put a +1/+1 counter on Memnite, the difference between 2 and 1. The exciting thing about this ability is every turn it's going to snowball. So let's say you get in another attack with Sovereign the next turn. Now your Memnite's going to have 3 power. It's going to be a 1/1 base power, then it's going to get +1/+1 from Glorious Anthem, but +1/+1 from the counter from the first Sovereign attack. Now you attack with the Sovereign. It's going to see Memnite, okay, base power 1, actual power 3. I'm going to put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And then if you attack again, it's going to put 4 +1/+1 counters and 8 +1/+1 counters. It's just going to keep snowballing, making your team bigger and bigger every single time it attacks. So that is how this works. The question is, what do we actually do with this card? So in Standard, it works really well with Jetmir. It's even a cat for the flavor win, but Jetmir, if you can max it out, is giving all your creatures +3/+0. So with 3 boosts to their base power, which means every Sovereign attack is going to put 3 +1/+1 counters on all of your creatures. Well, that's the first attack. The second attack will be 6 +1/+1 counters and so forth. It'll just keep snowballing, getting more and more aggressive as you go. So I think some sort of go-wide Jetmir deck would be perfect, because what Sovereign wants, which is a bunch of creatures with their base power being boosted, is the same thing that Jetmir wants and does. So I think that's one obvious home. Another example would be some sort of hardened scales deck. So I'm not saying this is actually going to work in like Modern or whatever. It's going to be way too slow. It's a 4-drop. You're not going to play some 4-drop non-artifact in Scales. But this is an example of what this could do. It works really well with all this stuff. So like Hangerback Walker, Walking Ballista, Arcbound Ravager, all these creatures technically have a base power of 0, but then they grow themselves with +1/+1 counters. So every Sovereign attack is going to be adding a ridiculous amount of counters to your creatures, and that's what you want, because all these creatures care about having counters added to them. Throw in a Hardened Scales, then it gets even more ridiculous, and we can even do something like this in Standard with the modify mechanic. We got Ozolith the Shattered Spire, some sort of like Naya modify +1/+1 counter deck. And one thing about Sovereign, the biggest drawback of this card is to do anything cool, it needs to attack. So what this means is normally you're gonna have to play this. It's gonna have to sit on the battlefield for a turn. You're gonna have to not get hit by a Farewell or a Sunfall or a targeted removal spell. Ward 2 helps, but people are gonna know that this card must die. Like, it is going to add so much power to the battlefield. It is going to be a lightning rod for removal. One of the best ways to get around this is just giving Sovereign haste. And we have like Invigorating Hot Spring in Standard, really good at giving haste. Also puts a counter on something to boost its power. So that's going to make it work with Sovereign. So I think that's going to be the way to go with this. If you can haste in your Sovereign with a board full of stuff that already has its base power being boosted by something, it can get wild really quick. Another cool way to build around this is turn temporary power buffs into permanent power buffs. So in Standard, we got cards like Heroic Charge, Inspired Charge. They give your creatures +2/+1 until end of turn. Well, if you have a Sovereign out, you can cast like a Heroic Charge, attack with your Sovereign. You're already getting buff from the Heroic Charge, but then you're going to get a number of counters equal to that buff that are going to stick around forever. So it kind of turns these temporary power buffs into permanent power buffs. If you want to go really deep, it's kind of hilarious with fractals. Like, imagine Body of Research, a 0/0 that's going to have like 40 counters on it. You attack with Sovereign, you're going to get 40 more counters. Do you need to make your Body of Research search token at 80/80? No, but it is pretty sweet. I mean, why win when you can win more, right? As far as Commander is concerned, I think this card's actually going to be very popular. You can throw it in any +1/+1 counter deck, and it's going to be a good addition. Shalai and Halar, Hamas, perfect addition there. It's also a cool cat card. A lot of cats work well with this. So I imagine this can be a generic +1/+1 counter commander. It can be a cat commander, or you can put it in the 99 to like a Rabo, has a temporary boost for your cats that sovereigns can turn permanent. We already talked about Jetmir from Standard. One thing we haven't talked about is you could also go like Voltron equipment with this card. Equipment are another way to boost your creature's power above its base power, and then every time you attack with your sovereign, you're going to get counters equal to that boost. So you could just try to like load your sovereign up with equipment. It's already got ward, so it's got a little protection, and just keep attacking and snowballing into this one-shot kill commander threat that's going to take down the table. So I think Sovereign is actually a really strong card. I know the wording on its ability a little bit clunky. I can't really think of a better way to word it for what it's trying to do, which is like double your buffs that you already have with +1/+1 counters. But I think this card is actually super legit, and people might sleep on it a little bit, just because I know some people, if you read like the spoiler threads of this card, are kind of like, oh, the ability is so confusing. What does this even do? I don't understand. So it might be a little bit underrated just because the ability is worded in a confusing way. But do not sleep on Sovereign. It is a really, really strong 4-drop. Next up, we got a spicy legendary artifact in Matzalantli. I am sure I'm butchering that. The Great Door. Let's just go with the Great Door, which flips around into the core. So the front side, the Great Door, 3-mana legendary artifact. You can tap it to lose. So draw a card, discard a card. More importantly, you can pay 4 and tap it and transform it if there are 4 or more permanent types in your graveyard. So you need at least 4 of artifact, battle, creature, enchantment, land, and planeswalker. The backside is one of the most ridiculous lands I've seen in a long time. It's the Core, a legendary land that taps to add X mana of any wind color, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. So the front side, it cares about permanent types. You have to have 4 of the 6 permanent types. The backside just cares about permanent. So if you have 20 creatures in your graveyard, this taps to make 20 mana, which is kind of absolutely ridiculous. So this card, it reminds me the most of Azur's Gateway, which was a legendary artifact from original Ixalan, maybe Rivals of Ixalan actually, but whatever, original Ixalan block, which you could tap to loot and then eventually transforms into a land that makes a lot of mana. I think that the Great Door is just a better version for the most part. The problem with Azur's Gateway is it takes a long time to flip, and then when you eventually flip it, the land cares about how much life you have, and it's possible you're pretty low on life, so it doesn't make that much mana. The Great Door, if you're playing some sort of self-mill style deck where you're all about filling your graveyard, this is going to make a ridiculous amount of mana very, very quickly. So how do you actually play this card? So it seems good in some sort of reanimator deck. You're using it like a collector vault almost, where you're looting your Atrox into the graveyard to reanimate it. You're gonna have to care a little bit more about permanent types. Maybe you play the battle reanimation spell or something over a spell-based reanimation spell. But if you can build around this a little bit and flip it, it is going to be really, really strong. The backside is one of the most ridiculous lands that we've seen in a long time. This compares to Cabal Coffers, Nykthos, Gaia's Cradle, these lands that tap for an absurd amount of mana. Yes, they're set up. Yes, you have to get to the point where you can actually do it. Yes, there's a risk that you never get there. There's a risk that the artifact side gets blown up. But should you achieve the goal of getting the core on the battlefield, this land is going to probably win you the game. How easy is it going to be to do? That's the question. So we've seen Delirium be achievable. The difference here is the Great Door essentially has Delirium, but only for permanents. Delirium cares about card types, which means instants and sorceries, which are really easy to get in your graveyard because you can just cast them and they go into your graveyard, can help turn on Delirium when they don't help turn on the Great Door. So it's harder to achieve Delirium, but still, I think if you build around it, you should be able to make this happen pretty consistently, especially in a deck that's built around self-milling and filling your graveyard, especially now that we have battles to up the permanent types. Like, this is going to be one of the sneaky places where battles really shine, even if you don't want a battle in your deck. Just the fact that it's an extra permanent to help you flip your Great Door into the core is going to make it worth it. But there is one concern I have for this card, which is we are heading into a standard format where there's a lot of graveyard shenanigans going on. Not only do we have the old graveyard shenanigans, so like reanimating stuff with Cruelty of Gix or whatever, we're getting all these new graveyard mechanics like Descend, all this stuff that's about looting, filling your graveyard, even crafting is about exiling stuff from your graveyard. there's a ton of graveyard shenanigans going on in our return to Ixalan, and I think this means that the value of graveyard hate is going to skyrocket, like to the point where I'm kind of thinking maybe Soul Guide Lantern is just like a legit main deck card that you just play and it can cantrip when it's bad, and when it's good it's gonna like wreck your opponent's graveyard synergies. Graveyard Trespasser, all this incidental graveyard hate is gonna go way up in value. So that's my worry, is if this card is good, it is easily counteracted by graveyard hate spells that are really cheap, really efficient, really plentiful. So that's kind of the check on the power. Like, the backside's busted, the front side's good enough to play. The problem is, if your opponent wipes your graveyard, all your work kind of goes out the window. So we'll have to see. Maybe the fact that graveyard hate is going to be very necessary in our new standard, by the looks, will keep this card in check. But this is a really strong card that I can't wait to build around. The good news is there's tons of graveyard filling effects. We've been talking about Urborg, Lurgoyf, and Cruel Somnophages. If you want to fill your graveyard for this card, you can do it at lightning speed, and the backside is so ridiculous it's going to be worth it. The other place this card I think is going to be great is in any self-mill or graveyard permanent heavy commander deck. So it's like built for Muldroltha. Muldroltha, all about getting permanents in your graveyard. You can cast them from your graveyard. Sidisi really cares about getting things in your graveyard. Imhotep also about getting things in your graveyard. In a deck like this, the Great Door is going to be one of the best cards in your deck. You can use it to loot, to filter through your deck and find your good pieces and fill your graveyard for your commander. And then if you flip it around, there's a decent chance you just win with some huge Exsanguinate or whatever, Torment of Hailfire. Name a big, huge X-Spell, you're probably going to be able to win the game with it. So seems like a great card for graveyard commander decks as well. So the Great Door / the Core, really excited to build around this card. This card just seems like a super fun challenge to build around, and I think it's actually really, really powerful. That said, it does scoop pretty hard to graveyard hate, and that probably will keep its power in check. If it ever gets too good, there's just like easy, cheap one-card answers that are like, oh, wipe your graveyard, and then it does nothing. So I don't think it can be too busted in the sense that anything that relies heavily on the graveyard, there's really good counterplay for, but still, this is one of my favorite cards from the sets, and the dream of just going off with the core is so intoxicating that I really can't wait to build around it. Next up, we got a new mythic that'll probably be the first against the odds card from this set in the Millennium Calendar. So Millennium Calendar, 1-mana legendary artifact. It says when one or more permanents become untapped during your untap step, put that many time counters on the Millennium Calendar. Pay 2 tap it, double the number of time counters on the Millennium Calendar, and then when there are 1,000 or more time counters on the Millennium Calendar, sack it, and each opponent loses 1,000 life. So the Millennium Calendar, I don't know what to say about this card. It definitely seems like a super sweet against the odds challenge. The idea of playing this 1-mana artifact and getting up to 1,000 counters and using it to just kill everyone on the spot is super, super cool. Someone on Reddit calculated it out, and if you play the Millennium Calendar on turn 1, and you use its ability every single turn, it will take 9 turns, I believe, played fairly, no other shenanigans, to win the game with Millennium Calendar, or theoretically win the game by making everyone lose 1,000 life. That should win you the game. There are a couple ways that could go wrong, but in general, it should win you the game. So if you play it on turn 1, it takes about 9 turns. Worth mentioning 2 things about this card before we talk about what you can do with it. First, no protection. We've seen in the past, like Helix Pinnacle, you needed to get 100 counters on it and make it to your upkeep to win the game. That had hexproof, so it was hard to kill. The Millennium Calendar, no form of protection at all. So there's going to be some nightmare scenarios here where you like get up to 700 counters and you need 1 more doubling to win the game, and then your opponent Ancient Grudges or Farewells or whatever. So no real protection here. One other thing to point out, because I saw some people confused by this, is you can't do anything during your untap step. You get to untap your stuff, but there's no like, I maintain priority during my untap step and like tap and untap Basalt Monolith 1,000 times to get 1,000 counters and win the game. You can't do anything during your untap step. That's just the rules of the game. There's no priority. There's no doing anything other than untapping your permanents. So there's no shenanigans there, but there are plenty of shenanigans with this card. So if you want to cheat a little bit and try to speed up the doom of the world with the Millennium Calendar, the easiest way to do it's probably Paradox Engine. Paradox Engine, I know. We broke Paradox Engine, says everyone. Paradox Engine, when you cast a spell, you untap all your non-land permanents. We've seen a resurgence of Paradox Engine thanks to the One Ring, where there's some pretty popular colorless artifact ramp style decks where you just turbo out the One Ring Paradox Engine, tap and untap, draw all your deck, eventually win the game somehow. Millennium Calendar, easy win with a Paradox Engine deck. You can likely win the turn that Paradox Engine does its thing, because it's going to keep untapping the Millennium Calendar. You're going to have tons of mana rocks on the battlefield, so tons of mana. So every time in between your Paradox Engine untapping, you just activate the double the counters thing on Millennium Calendar. So all it takes is like 9 spells or something, and you're going to end up just winning the game on the spot. So it seems like a cool finisher for a Paradox Engine deck. So if you're doing that in like Historic or maybe in Modern, great option there. In Modern, you can find this with Urza's Saga. So if you're trying to Paradox Engine combo, you have a way to consistently find it, go off the turn that you get it, tutoring up with the Urza's Saga. You can also try to do it like sort of fairly with just like counter doubling effects. Doubling Season, Vorinclex, anything like that is going to put twice the number of counters on your permanents. So when you double the counters with Millennium Calendar, you're actually kind of doubling twice, which is going to cut the time it takes to actually win the game with the card in half. Also just untapping it fairly. This is probably mostly a commander thing, but like Seedborn Muse untaps all your permanents during each other player's untap step. That means you can be using the doubling effect of this 4 times each turn cycle, which means a couple of times around the table, you should be able to win the game. Unwinding Clock does it for artifact decks. Also, Clock of Moments, just tap 2 artifacts, untap an artifact in some sort of artifact deck. You can probably construct your deck where you like play this, keep tapping and untapping stuff, and win the game in very short order with Millennium Calendar. It is worth mentioning, you do need a way to get the first counter on it, so it's going to be difficult to win the game with this without making it through your upkeep one time. You got to make it at least once to get that first counter, because without that first counter, you're doubling nothing. So just like playing Millennium Calendar and doing all this right away doesn't really work. I don't know if there's another way to add a time counter. I don't believe there's another way to add that first time counter. Obviously, once you have the first one, you can proliferate it, do all these shenanigans, but you're probably gonna have to play it and make it through your upkeep once and then start the doubling and all the shenanigans. It reminds me a little bit of Darksteel Rector in some ways, in the sense that most win the game cards, and I consider this essentially win the game card. I know it doesn't say the words win the game, instead it deals 1,000 damage to everyone. It essentially says win the game. Like, it just kills everyone with 1,000 damage. But one of the upsides of Darksteel Rector, which is another super tough to pull off win the game card, is it wins the game right away. Most win the game cards have an upkeep restriction, so even after you meet their requirement, you got to make it a whole turn cycle back to your next upkeep to win the game. Millennium Calendar doesn't have that. Like, as soon as it gets to 1,000 or more counters, you sack it, everyone loses 1,000, you win the game on the spot. So I really like that aspect of it, and that's what makes all those Paradox Engine type shenanigans, or even the Seedborn Mune type shenanigans, way more appealing, is there isn't that like win with suspend 1 that gives everyone around the table a chance to kill you, to kill your Millennium Calendar. Also really amazingly hilarious with All Will Be One. If you want to speed up the Millennium Calendar kill, maybe you don't actually try to win with Millennium Calendar, maybe you just play it and double the counters and play an All Will Be One, and when you double from like 50 counters to 100 counters, you're going to get 50 damage with All Will Be One and just kill your opponent that way. So you can probably use this to win with All Will Be One with way less than 1,000 counters. So how can this go wrong? That is the other question, because it doesn't actually say you win the game. Remember that. In a huge percentage of situations, Millennium Calendar says win the game, but there are also times when it doesn't actually say win the game. So in Commander, the biggest one's probably Teferi's Protection. You can do all your Millennium Calendar stuff, sack it to put the 1,000 damage on the stack, or 1,000 loss of life on the stack, and opponent just Teferi's Protection, your Millennium Calendar is gone, all the counters are gone, and your opponent's still alive. I guess it's also theoretically possible that someone could gain so much life it didn't work. Like, it only does 1,000. If your opponent can Soul Warden up to 1,001, and then I guess they got you. The other risk would be some sort of stifle effect, where you go to sacrifice this and your opponent counters the trigger, the 1,000 damage trigger. That would also be kind of annoying. It shouldn't happen too much. Stifle's not that heavily played, but I do think cards like Tail's End are kind of like very underrated in Commander, because it counters your opponent's commander, can also just answer something like the Millennium counter. So most of the time it's going to win you the game, but there are things to be aware of. Like, Teferi's Protection's a legit staple, and it's going to be super hilarious when someone actually does the work for this, only to get got by Teferi's Protection. So Millennium Calendar, I love this card. Very likely the first against the odds card that we play from the set. The challenge of getting 1,000 counters as quickly as possible seems super fun. I will say, card seems kind of miserable to play in paper. Like, to be adding a random number of counters based on how many permanents you have that untap during your untap step, and then doubling them, pretty mathy, lots of counters. I don't even know, how do you play this in paper? Are you just gonna have like a big pile of like 60 dice sitting on this card? How do you possibly manage it? Or do you have like, is there a D1000 and you have to like spin it around every time you change the number? So I don't know how this actually is gonna play in paper. It might be pretty annoying, but in digital at least, really cool design, cool flavor when calling back to, you know, the Aztec calendar and all that stuff. Super, super cool. We also got a new rare red equipment in Dire Fleet Fail. I guess it's actually Flail, but might as well be Dire Fleet Fail because I don't think this card's actually very good. So 1 mana to cast, 1 to equip, gives equip creature +2/+0, and then you can craft with an artifact for 5 mana, flip it around into Dire Fleet Cannon, which gives equip creature +3/+0, and has when this creature attacks, you can sack another artifact. If you do, this creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature. So the front side of this card, it's essentially Bone Splinter, except you need red mana on it, a common from 20 years ago. So you're essentially getting a common that's actually harder to cast, and then your reward for playing this common that's actually harder to cast is you can pay a massive 5 mana and exile another artifact, and you get a slightly upgraded Bone Splinter. You get 1 more power that can like let you sack an experimental synthesizer to deal damage to something. When this card was first spoiled, there was some debate over whether the backside said damage to target creature or damage to any target. If it was any target, I might actually be in the market for this card. It would still probably be pretty sketchy because it would be 6 total mana and crafting an artifact to actually get to the backside, but at least you'd be able to like grow a big creature, sack your experimental synthesizer, and like throw a ton of damage at your opponent's face. But since it only like hits a creature, I feel like this is designed to be a limited card. So I guess in Constructed, if you're in the market for a harder to cast Bone Splinter in your like red aggro deck, which maybe you are, maybe you just throw this on your red 1-drop and like get in some extra damage with your creatures, that is legitimate. So if you're in the market for a red Bone Splinter, I think that the front side's fine and could have some purposes in Constructed. In Constructed though, it is hard for me to imagine there's going to be many games where I want to spend 5 mana crafting to get the backside, considering it only kind of snipes opposing creatures. In Limited, I think that's probably a pretty relevant ability. I think that's the goal of this card, is like mostly the backside and the crafting and the flipping going to be something you do in Limited rather than Constructed. But in Limited, it's probably actually pretty good, is repeatable removal, assuming you have enough useless artifacts to sacrifice. Next up, we got another legendary artifact, this time a black one, in Tarrian's Journals / the Tomb of Achlazotz. So the front side, 2 mana, black legendary artifact. You can tap it, sack another artifact or creature to draw a card, only as a sorcery, which I think is pretty powerful. The only as a sorcery restriction does mean you can't like sack something your opponent's killing with a removal spell, but still like free once per turn sack outlet that draws you a card. Second ability, pay 2, tap it, discard your hand, transform it into the Tomb of Achlazotz. Tomb of Achlazotz taps to make a black mana, or you can tap it to cast a creature spell from your graveyard this turn. If you do, it enters the battlefield with a finality counter and is a vampire in addition to its other type. So the finality counter just means if it would die, it gets exiled instead. So you can't keep like playing the same creature. This card is very, very difficult to break down. So on one hand, I think a 2 mana legendary artifact that just taps to sack something and draw a card actually has some relevance. It reminds me a little bit, the backside in specific, of Journey of Eternity, this reanimating land from your graveyard. But I think the sack mode of this is what I'm most excited for. We're getting like vampires that care about things being sacked. We got Okinec Anvil that cares about things being sacked. This can sacrifice any other artifact or creature for free to generate card advantage and help like trigger your veto, get things in your graveyard, trigger your Okinec Anvil. So even just in that context, I think this is a pretty decent effect. The question is, how often do you actually use that last mode? I'm really not sure. I think this is going to be at its best is just like, play my Valerian Epicure, sack my blood token, draw a card. Play my Blood Tithe Harvester, sack my blood token, draw a card. Trigger my Okinec Anvil. Do I really want to 1-win-0 away my hand to get this sort of like Journey to Eternity backside land? It's going to come up on occasions, but I don't think that's a primary purpose. I think you play this in a deck where you're playing it as a card advantage engine in a sacrifice deck to work with the synergies of your deck. And then maybe there's times where you're like, all right, whatever, like I don't have many things in my hand right now. This is the time when I can actually flip this around. I am a little concerned though that 1-0, that's a really brutal effect. Like you could turbo this out. It is theoretically possible to like turn 2 play Journal, turn 3 2 mana, flip it around, discard your hand, go to town. Will that actually be something that's worth doing? It'll be hilarious if it ever works, but the cost of discarding your hand, even with a land that lets you cast things from your graveyard, it's really risky and it's super high. So we'll have to wait and see. I guess there are cases where it could be good, just like 1-0 where you're playing like a Madness deck and you want to discard stuff because you're going to cast it with mana. So we even have Markov Baron in Standard, a Madness Vampire. There's stuff that wants to come back from the graveyard, Gravecrawler. Maybe you're discarding a bunch of recursive threats, so you're just going to play from your graveyard anyway. In that context, it could be good. And plus, the land does help here. Like, if you got a handful of creatures and discard them, in theory, you can just use the Tomb of Eklazad's to cast those creatures from your graveyard anyway, so it's not quite as painful as it looks, although it is very awkward that you're like, using its first mode to fill your hand with cards, and then its second mode wants you to discard all your cards. So there's a lot of tension there. Probably really good in Niheb. If you're playing some sort of deck that intentionally wants to be Hellbent or Heckbent and get out of cards, then this is a good way to get the job done because it can let you empty your hand. Plus, it can give you card advantage in a situation where you don't want to be emptying your hand. So Tarrian's Journal, I think this card's very good. I really like it as a free card advantage generating sack outlet that can sack artifacts or creatures in a standard where we're going to have map tokens and blood tokens and treasure tokens. We have all these random artifact tokens. This is often going to be just like 2 mana, sack something useless, draw an extra card each turn. That by itself is a powerful effect, especially in a deck that is taking advantage of things going in and out of the graveyard. The second mode, not sure how often we're going to use it. I'm sure there will be times where it's going to be super sweet and game winning, but I think a lot of times I want to just like keep sacking to draw cards rather than doing the 1-0 thing, but we'll have to wait and see. I'm curious what you think. How often do you think you actually do the 1-0 thing and flip into Tomb of Eklazad's? Or is this just a card that stays out and you use that first mode in a sack deck to generate card advantage? We also got Raging Hammerskull, a 3 mana 6/6 dinosaur that says when it attacks, if you don't control another dinosaur, put a stun counter on it. So things with stun counters don't untap, but you remove a stun counter instead. So essentially by itself, this is a 3 mana 6/6 that can only attack every other turn. So what can we do with Raging Hammerskull? And I think there's really 2 options. So first off, I don't think this card's worth playing fairly. It does play defense very well. Like, it's just a 3 mana 6/6 blocker, so if you just want to stonewall stuff on defense, it does do that. You can play it like a weird dinosaur wall. But assuming you're actually hoping to attack with it, I don't think you play it fairly. Like, in a generic mono green deck without any synergies, I think only being able to attack every other turn, too much of a drawback to make it worth it. But there's 2 ways around this. First, you just play dinosaurs. If you have another dinosaur, this is just a 3 mana 6/6, which is super far above the curve. Even in 2023, 3 mana 6/6, really huge amount of stats for its mana value. So if you're playing a dinosaur deck, and there's a pretty good chance that you're gonna have another dinosaur on the battlefield, this seems like a staple level dino stompy beatdown creature that is just so massive that it's gonna be able to attack through anything on the battlefield. So really good for dinosaur decks. The other place this will really shine is fight rigging decks. We still have fight rigging in Standard. Now with Raging Hammerskull joining Shakedown Heavy, we have 2 3-drops that by themselves add enough power to trigger fight rigging the turn it comes into play, which is greatly going to increase the consistency of fight rigging. So I think this card might make fight rigging into a legit threat in Standard now, having like fight rigging plus Hammerskull plus Shakedown Heavy. They just load up your deck with Atraxos portals, whatever big finishers you want. That plan might actually be pretty legitimate now that we have another 6-powered 3-drop. So Raging Hammerskull has a pretty jaw-dropping amount of stats. Gonna be kind of narrow in where you can play it, just because if you can only use it every other turn, it loses a lot of its value. But there are multiple ways to get around that, and in those decks, this card seems really good. Speaking of dinosaurs, we also got Palani's Hatcher. So a 5 mana Gruul 5/3 dinosaur It says other dinosaurs you control have haste. When it ETBs, you create 2/0/1 green dinosaur egg creature tokens, and the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control one or more eggs, sack an egg, and then create a 3/3 green dinosaur creature token. So this card, if it looks similar, it's actually very, very similar to Regisaur Alpha. So Regisaur Alpha, last time we were in Ixalan, kind of did the same thing. 5-drop, 4/4, other dinos have haste. When it ETBs, you create a 3/3 green dinosaur creature token with trample. So at first glance, Palani's Hatcher is essentially Regisaur Alpha, but just upgraded and better. So you play this in your pre-combat main phase, you go to combat, you sack one of the eggs, you get a 3/3, it's going to have haste because of Palani's Hatcher. So in that sense, as long as this makes it to your first combat, which it usually should, you already have Regisaur Alpha. Like, you already build a Regisaur Alpha, you lose 1 toughness, gain 1 power, and you have an egg left over on the battlefield. If this makes it to your second combat, you can sack the second egg, and you have a Regisaur Alpha that made 2 3/3s, which is a pretty big upgrade over OG Regisaur Alpha. And Regisaur Alpha was actually like kind of a staple dinosaur. Dinosaurs last time we were in Ixalan, they were never like a super duper tip top tier, one of the best decks in the format, but there were dinosaur decks, and Regisaur Alpha was one of the key cards in those decks. So I think that Palani's Hatcher, just the fact that it hastes in your big scary dinosaurs, it adds 3 dinosaurs to the battlefield, and in theory over the course of a couple of turns can add 11 power to the battlefield if you get both of the 3/3s out of the eggs. I think this is a card that if dinos are a thing, we will almost certainly see this in the 5-drop slot. It's just a really strong effect. Of course, if you want to go deep with it, you can like use token synergies to make a lot of dinosaur eggs. Mondrak, Doubling Season, Usher Talk, like you can be making a ton of eggs. I don't know how valuable those are. Like, they're just 0/1s until you can hatch them. But still, like, it does work well with token synergies. Also in Commander, outside of obviously like played in dinosaurs, kind of built to go in Atla Palani. Atla Palani, like, I think this is the Palani and Palani's Hatcher. Like, Atla Palani makes eggs, the eggs turn into big things. So if you're playing Atla Palani, not only is this card good in your deck because it's another way to make eggs, it is also very much a flavor win for your Atla Palani deck. So Palani's Hatcher, the card seems legit to me. It's like Regisaur Alpha, but better, and Regisaur Alpha was already a pretty good card. Next up, we got a new 4-mana black, mostly Wrath in Terror Tide. So 4 mana, 2 and 2 black, sorcery. All creatures get -X until end of turn, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. It says Fathomless Descent. I don't know why there's like, what is up with these keywords? Why is there so many different versions of Descent? Do we really need Descend, Descended, Fathomless Descent? What are you doing with these keywords, Watsy? I have literally no idea. You could probably use to simplify it. I don't think that word Fathomless is really adding anything at all to this card. Like, it's just taking up room on the card, and actually, instead of making it clear, just makes it more confusing. So I don't know what they're doing with these weird keywords, but the card itself seems pretty good. So like any Descend style card, it does have the weakness that if your opponent can keep your graveyard offline, it's not going to do anything. But if you think about this, in a self-mill deck with a lot of permanents, this can easily be a Damnation or a upgraded Mutilate style effect. Like, you easily just wiping the entire board for 4 mana, which is pretty exciting. We've seen in Standard, there's plenty of ways to fill your graveyard. This seems built for the Urborg Lorgoyf Cruel Somnophage Soul of the Lost deck, where you just aggressively self-mill. You're already playing all permanents. You play this, you wipe away your opponent's board. You might even keep some of your stuff online, like your Souls of the Lost. Its power and toughness is equal to the number of permanents in your graveyard, but its toughness is +1. So in theory, your Soul of the Lost is always going to survive this. Sure, it's going to get small for the turn, but the next turn, your opponent's board is going to be gone. You're going to have this massive Soul of the Lost to close out the game. So there are some ways this can even be a one-sided Wrath in the right deck. So I think this card certainly has a home in permanent heavy self-mill style decks. Plus, we've been talking about all this graveyard filling stuff, Tarrian's Journal. There's so many things that just care about you, like getting permanents into your graveyard, and there's so many permanents can get in your graveyard, legend rolling away your own legendary artifacts, all these looting and sacrifice effects, that I think this card might actually be a very important card for Standard. Yes, of course, Sunfall Farewell, they're busted, but this is a black card, not a white card, so I don't think they're directly competing. And in some sort of Descend graveyard filling deck, I think this is at best a main deck card. At worst, it seems like a sideboard all-star. Also, I think this is a card that serves a purpose in Commander. So in Commander, if you got the hierarchy of Black Wraths, you got Toxic Deluge 1, You got I Say Damnation number 2. This is one of those wraths that in just a generic deck is not going to be very good. If you're just playing some generic deck that's not focused on getting things into your graveyard, you're going to play Toxic Deluge or Damnation. On the other hand, if you're playing a deck that's built around filling your graveyard, especially a deck that's focused on getting permanents into your graveyard, like Madraltha or Sidisi, then I think Terror Tide is probably Wrath number 2 or Wrath number 3. I think Toxic Deluge is still number 1, but this is probably number 2 or number 3 as far as the wrath that'll be in your deck. So in those decks, I think this is actually just a legit option for your commander decks as well. I think maybe it could have some Pioneer play. I was trying to think, okay, like, is there a deck that can make this work in Pioneer? And if you look at like Greasefang in Pioneer, a lot of times it's playing a couple Extinction events in the sideboard. Greasefang's a deck that's pretty good at filling the graveyard. It does have a decent number of spells, but it is pretty permanent heavy. If you look at a Greasefang list, it's usually like 45 permanents in the main, maybe like 15 spells in the main, which I think is enough that maybe Terror Tide just replaces Extinction event in the sideboard slot in a deck like that to help you, buy some time against aggro. The one concern is the same concern I have for all the Descent cards, which is it's going to be a little bit high risk because your opponent Soul Guide Lanterns your graveyard, and this card just does stone nothing. It goes from Damnation to literally 4 mana, do nothing at all. And I'm really thinking, just with all this graveyard stuff we're seeing, I think Graveyard Hate's going to be very popular in Standard. Like, I'm actually thinking I'm just going to jam Soul Guide Lantern in the main deck of my decks just because there's so many graveyard themes. So I think that that's going to be the question for this card. Is there too much Graveyard Hate? If no one's playing Graveyard Hate and you're playing a self-mill deck, this is one of the best wraths you can have in your deck, at least back to Pioneer and in some commander decks. If everyone's playing Graveyard Hate and someone Rest in Pieces or even Soul Guide Lanterns, then you're going to be very, very sad that you're playing this graveyard dependent wrath over a wrath that doesn't need cards in your graveyard to work. Next up, we got Poetic Ingenuity, a 3-mana enchantment that does a couple of different things. When you attack with 1 or more dinosaurs, you get to make that many treasures, and then when you cast an artifact spell, you get to make a 3/1 red dinosaur creature token, but only once each turn. So this is showing off Saheeli and Huatli, and I like the flavor of this card. You get the dinosaur thing from Huatli, you get the artifact token synergies from Saheeli, so it's a cool way to mesh those two things together. Is this card actually playable? I'm a little skeptical. So I think here's my biggest issue with this card. I think that dinosaurs, actually I don't even think this, I know this is just statistically true, dinosaurs tend to be pretty expensive. And I think Poetic Ingenuity, it would be at its best in a deck that's like 1-drop, 2-drop, Poetic Ingenuity, attack with 2 dinosaurs, make 2 treasures. That's the strongest thing this card can do. And I'm just not sure that dinosaurs can do that, because dinosaurs tend to be 3 mana, 5 mana, 8 mana. They're very, very big and expensive. The dinosaur making part of this card does help, but even that's like kind of slow. So you play this on turn 3, turn 4, you cast an artifact spell, which, are you playing artifact spells in your dinosaur deck? And then you get a 3/1, and then the next turn you can attack and get a treasure. It is nice that the treasures come into play untapped. So I wonder if this card, the flavor's really cool. And I can imagine situations where it's good, but I'm just not sure if it really lines up with what the decks that could theoretically play it want to be doing. So if you look at like dinosaurs in Standard, the cheapest options are what? Like Raging Hammerskull, Thrashing Bronodon. You're kind of starting at 3 mana, which is the same amount of mana that this is. I guess stuff like Palani's Hatcher is kind of nice because that puts multiple dinosaurs on the battlefield, but still that's more like I'm going to ramp from 5 up to 8 for my Gishath rather than an early game plan. And then I'm really struggling to figure out, like, in my dinosaur deck, I'm probably playing early game ramp, early game removal, in a bunch of dinosaurs. What artifacts am I going to be playing in my dinosaur deck to trigger the second mode to make dinosaurs? I guess like Treasure Map, we've talked a lot about Soul Guide Lantern maybe being really good in New Standard, Mishra's Research Desk, I guess, but even these are like, I don't know, some of them are kind of a stretch that your dinosaur deck would want them, because you might want to be like ramping or killing something on turn 1 or 2 rather than playing one of these random artifacts. And plus, you gotta wait until you get Poetic Ingenuity on the battlefield anyway, so I don't know. I think this card is cool, but it seems to me like it's gonna be hard to make it work in 60 card formats. I think in a dinosaur commander deck, I would jam it and it's gonna be really good. And maybe that's the purpose of this card, is dinosaur commander decks. In a dinosaur commander deck, You jam this, it can be one of your ramp spells. If you think about it, like, you only got to be attacking with 1 dino each turn, and you build a 3-mana mana rock. Plus, you get the upside that if you're attacking with 5 dinos, you're getting a ridiculous amount of mana, and the treasures don't even come into play tapped, which is ridiculous. And then, in a commander deck, you're probably playing random, like, mana rocks or whatever, so that's going to incidentally make you some dinos. So I think maybe that's the role from the card. In Standard, though, in other 60-card formats, it's a very weird mix. So, I don't know, maybe it's way better than I think. I can see those explosive turns. I can picture in my head, like, wow, like, in my dream scenario, I play this, got a bunch of dinos, ramp into Gishath, take over the game, it's going to be awesome. But at the same time, I think it's going to be hard to build a deck that does all the things that this card wants outside of Commander. We also got a new rare cave land in Sunken Citadel. So Sunken Citadel, it's a cave. It ETB's tapped. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a color. It taps to add a mana of the chosen color, or it taps to add 2 mana of the chosen color. But you can spend that mana only to activate the abilities of land sources. So Sunken Citadel, on level 1, it's basically a cave uncharted haven. ETB tap, makes the color of your choice, sure, whatever. The upside of this card is, apart from being a cave, and we have seen some cave payoff, so if you're playing a deck that has cave synergies, obviously goes up in value. The big payoff is, it can be a land that taps for 2 mana, and throughout Magic's history, lands that make 2 mana have been pretty busted. Like, Ancient Tomb City of Traders are foundations of legacy decks. Eldrazi Temple, super busted during Eldrazi Winter. So anytime you see a land that taps to make 2 mana, you have to take notice of it, and it has a pretty good track record of being busted. I do wonder, though, if being restricted to activating abilities of land sources might be enough to make this one fair. So what can we actually do with this? And I think the main idea is twofold. One is, we got a bunch of creature lands in Standard, so this essentially makes a mana of the color of your choice to do whatever with, or it adds 2 mana to activate your Restless Prayer or your any other creature land. It's also really cool in a cave deck. Remember, we have this cycle of common caves that discover 4 for 5 mana. Having Sunken Citadel to make 2 mana to discover with your caves, that actually is a nice little bonus. Also makes, like, your Cavernous Maw a lot easier to activate. So I could see in a deck built around these cards, it could be really, really strong. So maybe that's the purpose. This is like a payoff for your other caves, which seem to have a lot of activated abilities. The other thing that you could do with this card is try to use it with filter lands. So filter lands are really, really weird. They're lands that have an ability where you can pay 1 mana and then add 2 mana of some combination of its 2 colors. So that is technically an ability that you'd be activating. So if you have a Sunken Citadel and then 2 filter lands, you can, like, Sunken Citadel for black mana, use one of that black mana to activate Graven Cairns to make 2 mana, use the other one to activate Sunken Ruins to make 2 mana, and you essentially built a real ancient tomb, essentially. Like, Sunken Citadel with 2 filter lands of the same activation color essentially is a land that taps for 2 mana. Is it going to be worth the work? You need 3 different lands. The filter lands are kind of on the outs. You don't usually play them because there's a lot of other land cycles these days that are just better, but maybe, like, there's a deck that embraces this plan, the filter land plan, just to be able to have essentially a painless ancient tomb in Modern. So we'll have to wait and see. I think that is its best chance of being, like, a Modern playable card. I've seen some people be like, oh, really good with Nykthos or Cabal Coffers. I mean, yeah, sure, like, it adds +1 mana for activating your Nykthos or Cabal Coffers, but I don't think you want to play, like, a bad land to get a 1 mana discount on your Nykthos or Cabal Coffers. I think Cabal Coffers would rather just have another swamp on the battlefield. You're better off just being +1 swamp than getting +1 mana from Sunken Citadel, so I don't think it's actually worth it in that context. The other possibility is there's some combo that I haven't found yet. I tried to dig around and, like, construct an infinite combo with getting 2 mana to activate the ability on lands. I couldn't come up with anything, but if you have some ideas, definitely let me know, because it is an interesting design, and anytime a land taps for 2, you gotta take notice, because over Magic's history, that has been a busted effect. Next up, we got a little descending Goblin Rogue 1-drop in Stalactite Stalker. So 1 mana 1/1, it's a Goblin Rogue, it's a black card, it has menace. It's at the beginning of your end step if you descended this turn. So had a permanent go into your graveyard from anywhere, put a +1/+1 counter on it, then you pay 3 saga, target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is its power. So my first thought was, is this card good enough for Modern? And the answer is maybe. So I don't think Goblins want it. I feel like Goblins is too combo-y for this card to really be worth it. But this card does play pretty well with fetch land. So on turn 1, crack a fetch, get a swamp, play this, end step it becomes a 2/2 menace. A 2/2 menace on turn 1 isn't bad. It should be able to get in for 2, and then if you crack another fetch land the next turn, it's going to be a 3/3 and then a 4/4, and then I guess you get the upside of maybe sacking it eventually to kill something. So I think there's some chance that because of the interaction with fetch lands making it so easy to descend, maybe there's some sort of black aggro deck that can take advantage of this in a format like Modern. Kinda on the fence. I think the most obvious home for this card is to be a 1-drop for the graveyard decks in Standard. So right now, Deathbonnet Sprout is kind of like the main 1-drop if you want to play the Urborg Lurgoyf deck. I feel like this is going to join Deathbonnet Sprout in that deck. Not going to grow as fast in Standard because you can't do the turn 1 fetch land, crack it, play this, grow it trick. But still, if you're playing a Urborg Lurgoyf, Cruel Somnophage style deck, you should be milling a permanent every turn. So this is a 1-drop that's going to get really big throughout the game, eventually might turn into a removal spell, and it has Menace to sneak in for damage. So I think in the graveyard descend deck in Standard, this is probably just like a really solid 1-drop that's going to help fill out turn 1 on the curve. We also got, oh my god, this card is so ridiculous, Moble Throne. So I know I'm probably going to way overrate this card because of my love for Panharmonicons, but seriously, this is like one of the most ridiculous cards I've seen in a while. So 4 mana 4/4 Ward to Golem. When it ETBs, you choose a creature type. It is that type in addition to its other types. And then it says if a triggered ability from another creature you control of the chosen type triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So when you first read this, it reads like a weird creature Panharmonicon, specifically for tribal decks. Like if you're playing a bunch of creatures of the same type, you're not going to play in any deck, obviously, because in like standard Panharmonicon, if you have Elesh Norn and you have Spirited Companion, like it's not going to line up. All your creatures aren't the same type, so it's not going to do enough. What makes this card so ridiculous, though, is this is a Panharmonicon for one creature type, or a Yarok for one creature type, but it actually is not just a Panharmonicon. Panharmonicons and Yaroks, they care about things entering the battlefield in specific. Moble Throne, it works with things entering the battlefield of the right creature type, but it also works with any triggered ability. And when you think about what this means, I think this card is actually just going to be one of the most hyped, one of the most played cards from this entire set, at least in Commander. I'm going to play it in 60 card formats because I love it. So on level 1, it's another Panharmonicon. You play this in your Wizard deck. Wizards have lots of ETBs, and you double up your Ether Channeler ETB. You play it in Elementals, definitely the best Elemental from the set, to go with your Omnes and your Risen Reefs, all their ETBs. You play it with your allies. All your allies have these ETBs that are powering each other up. Moble Throne, best ally from the set, maybe the best ally of all time. Play it in your Sliver deck. Slivers, everything triggering, going off, getting massive, blowing up all the stuff with Harmonic Sliver. So you can play it like a Panharmonicon, index build around a specific creature type, but that's not why I'm so hyped for this card. What makes this card so absurd is working with any triggered ability. So here's an easy example. You play this, you name Phyrexian, your Shieldred double triggers. Every time you draw a card, you gain 4. Every time your opponent draws a card, they lose 4. And that's just a really bad example, because I don't think you're actually going to pay this to make Shieldred better in Standard. I would be surprised. But look at these popular commanders. This is a list of like some of the most popular commanders in all of the game. And these are all cards that Panharmonicon does nothing with. Literally, Panharmonicon, Yarok, Elesh Norn, no value at all, but Moble Throne is ridiculous with. So Atraxa, OG Atraxa, end step, proliferate, that's a triggered ability. With Moble Throne on Angel or Horror, it's going to proliferate twice. It's an amazing elf. You put it in Lathro. Lathro has an ability. When it deals combat damage to a player, you create that many 1/1 elf tokens. You have Moble Throne on elf, and it is an elf, so it's upping your elf count for Lathro or whatever. That ability will trigger twice. You get twice as many elves. Eureka. Anytime your ninjas deal damage, you're going to get twice the Eureka reveal a card damage trigger. Prosper has 2 triggered abilities. At your end step exile card, you play it till the next turn. When you play a card from exile, make a treasure. With a Moble Throne naming Tiefling or Warlock, you're going to exile 2 cards. Every card you play from exile, you're going to make 2 treasures. Maybe you play an Eowyn. Eowyn has an ability. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if a human ETB'd under your control, you make 2 Knight tokens and they get Trample and Haste. If you have a Moble Throne naming human or Knight, you're going to get 4 of them instead. Aragon. Aragon has all these abilities that trigger when you cast something. Panharmonicon doesn't do anything with cast triggers. You play Moble Throne on human, and everything you cast, you're gonna double trigger your Aragon. Maybe you put it on zombie for Verena for its attract trigger, Olivia on vampire for its reanimation trigger, Vito on vampire or cleric to double up its drain trigger. This card can go in so many decks. So obviously, it's going to be at its best if you're an actual tribal deck. If you're a deck built around one creature type, going to be a little wonky to play it as like a generic Panharmonicon. If your creatures is just a whole bunch of different types, that's where it's going to be a little bit weird. But this powers up so many things that I think when we look back on this set in the future, this is going to be maybe the most played commander card from the set. It's colorless. It can go in any deck. It does cool things. It's very powerful. It protects itself. So this for me is a Panharmonicon for decks built around one creature type, but it's also so much more. I'm like honestly blown away that this is a thing. The fact that this works with any triggered ability, anyone, attack triggers, beginning of combat triggers, upkeep triggers, there's so many triggers in Magic that this card can go in so many decks, and it is going to just be super ridiculous, super fun, super powerful. Probably my new favorite card from the set, in all honesty. I know it's not a surprise. Oh, Sid likes a Panharmonicon. Of course, but this is way better than a Panharmonicon. It's like so absurd. So, Moble Throne. High hopes for this one. We're going to do crazy things with it, but I actually think this is a legit playable card that's going to show up in a lot of commander decks, and maybe even some 60 card format decks too. I mean, 4-mana 4/4 with War 2, that's not bad, especially when you add in all the creature type synergies. Rounding things out today, we got one new box topper. This is a Chromatic Orrery. We haven't got the English version yet, but Chromatic Orrery, I didn't realize is actually up to almost $30, so pretty solid reprint in the box topper slot. We also got a bunch of lower rarity cards, handful I wanted to mention super quick individually. Staunch Crewmate, 2-mana 2/1 human pyro. When ETBs, you can grab a artifact or a pirate from your top 4. 2 drops that cantrip, pretty good. So if you're a pirate deck or some sort of artifact deck, I think this could certainly have a role as just a 2-mana 2/1 that replaces itself when it enters the battlefield. Soulcoil Viper, actually kind of interestingly cheap reanimation. So 3-mana 2/3 snake, you can pay 1 and sack it and reanimate a creature from your graveyard with a finale counter on it. So if it dies, it goes to exile only as a sorcery. So essentially like Doom Necromancer, but bumped down to uncommon. I guess the downside is you get that finality counter, but still, like, this was a rare 20 years ago. Now it's a random uncommon. We also got Abyssal Gorestalker, 6-mana 6/6 horror. When it ETBs, each player sacks 2 creatures. So this is essentially barter in blood on a stick. If your deck really cares about people sacrificing things, maybe you're Turgrid and you play this, everyone's got to sacrifice, and you could like blink it or something, reanimate it, which you can't do with barter in blood. This could be in the conversation. We also got Dauntless Dismantler, which I feel is a card that's kind of built for modern. So 2-mana 1/4 human artificer says artifacts your opponents control ETB tapped, and then you can pay white and double X, sack it to destroy each artifact with mana value of X. So obviously this is a hate card to slow down opposing artifact decks. The reason I'm excited about it is even though it's not as strong of hate as Stony Silence, having your opponent's artifacts ETB tapped, that is going to slow your opponent's artifact down. It's also a creature, which is relevant with Creature Tutors, Court of Calling Collected Company. I think this is kind of built to wreck Urza's Saga. This is a human card that you can play, and eventually you can sacrifice for 1 mana to blow up all the construct tokens from Urza's Saga, and as a 2-mana 1/4, it actually blocks really well against aggro threats. Like, it's not going to die to Bowmasters, it's going to Stonewall Ragavods. So we'll have to see. Modern's in a really weird place right now where it's essentially just scam versus 5-color value piles. Not sure where this fits in that world, but once Modern goes through a shakeup, be it with bannings, be it with Modern Horizons 3, this is a card of Modern playable power level. Like, keep this in mind for your sideboard slots, especially if your deck that cares about creatures, because you have the chords and the collected companies and so forth. Also want to mention Sunbird Standard. So this is a new 3-mana mana rock that's kind of interesting. I'm a big lover of 3-mana mana rocks. I know people don't like 3-mana mana rocks anymore. I like 3-mana mana rocks with upside. Is this enough of an upside for it to see playing Commander? So 3 mana taps to make a mana of any color. Then you can craft with 1 or more other permanents and or cards. So literally anything in 5 mana. You exile it, it comes back as Sunbird Sunbird Effigy, a star with its power and toughness equal to the number of colors among cards exiled to craft it. It has flying, vigilance, and haste, and then it taps to add a mana for each color among cards exiled to craft it. So in a 5-color deck, this is a 3-mana mana rock that you can pay 5, exile cards of each color from your graveyard. It can be literally any cards at all. You flip into a 5/5 flying vigilance haste flyer that taps for 5 mana. So in some sense, crafting it's kind of free in a 5-color deck, assuming you hit all the colors, because you spend 5 to craft it. Actually kind of generates a mana because you can actually tap the front side for a mana and then use that to help pay for the crafting cost. But it's essentially free or even generating mana in a 5-color deck. Assuming you exile a card of each color, you can even sneak in some damage. So you like flip this, go to combat, smack someone for 5, and then post combat it taps for the 5 mana you spent to craft it anyway. Is this enough to make it worth it? The challenge is in 5-color, I really like Chromatic Lantern. That's the one archetype where I like Chromatic Lantern, but I think it's like on the cusp of being enough upside to be playable as a mana rock in a 5-color commander deck. The big upside is if it survives a turn, then it's insane. Like the first turn, crafting it's essentially free. The second turn, it's just tapping for 5 mana and a 5/5 flying body on the battlefield. So the upside, it's really on the fence. I think I'm going to try it. I'm kind of thinking it won't make it. The one place I love it though, 5-color Historic Brawl decks, new staple in Historic Brawl. Of course, there's also a bunch of other lower rarity stuff that's going to round out the limited format. You can find it all over at MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers for today. This set's absurd. This set's so absurd. It's so powerful. It's so flavorful. This is my vote for set of the year. Discounting, you know, Universes Beyond Lord of the Rings stuff, that set's probably the set of the year in all honesty. But as far as actual in-universe standard sets, pretty sure Ixalan is going to go down as the best one in 2023. That's how high I am on this set. But let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back tomorrow with more Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers. Until then, have a spectacular day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, make sure to check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the video where we show some arena zoomers that if they play creatures, there's going to be repercussions.